morning began like any other day. The air was still cool, and soft light filled the streets as the sun climbed slowly. In a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city, a man named Daniel stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. The smell of fresh grass drifted through the air. His neighbor waved as she walked her dog, and he returned the wave with a calm smile. For years, Daniel had lived a life built on quiet routines. He liked to keep things simple. Every morning he woke up before everyone else, made his coffee, read the news on his tablet, and drove the same road to the field office. People in the neighborhood knew him as the polite man who always had a steady voice and kind eyes. What most of them didn't really know was what he did for a living. They only knew he worked for the government. In truth, Daniel was an FBI agent. He didn't talk about his work much, not because he was secretive by nature, but because it was easier to live a normal life when you left the job at the door. Over the years, he had handled difficult cases, ones that weighed heavily on his mind. But when he was home, he liked to be just Daniel, not Agent Reed. That morning, his wife walked into the kitchen with their little girl still half asleep in her arms. Daniel leaned down and kissed them both on the forehead before finishing his coffee. It was the small, ordinary things that gave him peace. A quiet breakfast, a silly cartoon playing in the background, the soft laughter of his daughter as she tried to eat toast too big for her little hands. Before leaving, he adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. There was something steady about the way he carried himself, like someone who had always known his purpose. He had joined the bureau not for power, not for status, but because he believed in doing things the right way. The drive to work was uneventful. A light breeze came through the car window and the radio played an old song he hadn't heard in years. He tapped the steering wheel lightly in rhythm. At that moment, everything felt ordinary, predictable, safe. When he arrived at the field office, the parking lot was already half full. He greeted the security guard at the entrance the way he always did. Inside, the familiar smell of strong coffee and polished floors filled the air. He walked through the metal detector, flashed his badge, and headed toward his department. But something felt a little different that day. Not obvious at first, just a subtle change in the air. A few coworkers avoided eye contact when he passed. Someone quickly turned off their conversation when they noticed him approaching. He shrugged it off at first. Everyone had off days. He went to his desk, logged into his computer, and began reviewing reports from the previous week. But the quiet whispers around him didn't disappear. They grew sharper, like distant thunder rolling in. Two unfamiliar men in dark suits walked down the hallway toward the director's office. They weren't from his unit. He had never seen them before. People around the office stiffened as they passed. Daniel noticed the way the room seemed to hold its breath for just a second. Then his supervisor stepped out of her office. She looked straight at Daniel, then quickly looked away. Normally, she greeted him with a quick nod or a warm "good morning," but not today. She disappeared down the hallway, leaving Daniel with a strange weight in his chest. He leaned back in his chair, trying to shake off the thought. He had no reason to worry. He hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe this was about something else entirely, but the uneasiness didn't leave him. It sat quietly at the back of his mind like a shadow. During lunch, he walked to the cafeteria downstairs. He spotted a colleague he often ate with, someone he trusted. When Daniel walked up to the table, the man smiled nervously but didn't make room for him like he usually did. It was as if the air between them had changed. Daniel tried to start a casual conversation. "Busy morning?" he asked. The man's fork froze in midair. "Yeah, something like that," he said without looking up. His tone was short, distant. Daniel studied him for a second. This was someone who usually talked too much. About sports, about weekend plans, about office gossip. But today he couldn't even hold eye contact. "Is something going on?" Daniel asked carefully. His colleague gave a forced laugh, the kind people give when they don't want to answer. "Nothing, just the usual," he mumbled. Then he excused himself and left his half-eaten lunch on the table. Daniel sat there for a moment, alone, watching him walk away. It was like standing in the middle of a crowd that suddenly turned silent. He didn't know why, but he could feel something moving around him, something he couldn't yet see. Back at his desk, Daniel focused on his files. If something was wrong, he'd hear about it officially. The bureau didn't keep things vague for long. But even as he tried to work, he couldn't ignore the way people avoided looking at him directly. The day moved slowly. Each hour stretched like a long shadow. When the clock finally hit 5, Daniel logged off and walked toward the exit. Normally, a few colleagues would walk with him, chatting about weekend plans or upcoming meetings. But this time he walked alone. Outside, the air was cooler than usual. A few clouds floated low, hinting at rain. Daniel unlocked his car and slid into the driver's seat. He sat there for a moment without starting the engine, just listening to the sound of the distant traffic. He couldn't explain it, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just in his head. There was something bigger happening behind the scenes. He drove home along the same familiar road, past the grocery store, past the playground where his daughter liked to swing on weekends. The city lights flickered to life as dusk settled in. When he walked through the door, his wife greeted him with a smile, unaware of the strange undercurrent in his day. His daughter ran into his arms, wrapping her little hands tightly around his neck. For a while, the warmth of home pushed the uneasiness away. They ate dinner together, talking about small things, school, neighbors, plans for the weekend. The kind of conversations that keep life grounded. But later that night, when everyone was asleep, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in his head, the avoided glances, the unfamiliar faces, the silence from people who usually never stopped talking. He didn't know it yet, but this was the calm before the storm. In just a few hours, everything in his life was going to change. Daniel closed his eyes, hoping that whatever it was, it would pass. He had faced challenges before. He had worked through pressure, accusations, and long investigations. But this felt different. It wasn't about a case. This time it felt personal. Somewhere out there, decisions were already being made. Files were being reviewed. Plans were being drawn. And Daniel, without even realizing it, had just become the center of it all. As he stood to turn off the lights, he glanced at the family photo on the wall. It showed him, his wife, and his daughter on a sunny afternoon at the park. The three of them were smiling, unaware of the storm that would come one day. He whispered softly to himself, "Tomorrow will be fine." He believed it, or at least he wanted to believe it. But deep down, that quiet uneasiness didn't go away. It grew louder, waiting for the moment everything would unravel. Outside, the night settled over the neighborhood, calm and peaceful. No one could have guessed that by the next day, Daniel's name would be whispered not as a respected agent, but as a suspect. Daniel woke up the next morning with a strange heaviness in his chest. The house was quiet. He could hear faint bird song outside the bedroom window. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen, just like every morning. But even with the familiar sound, something about the air felt different. He tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing. People have bad days at work all the time. He told himself it was just office politics, maybe some new internal review he hadn't been informed about yet. He went through his routine like always. Shower, clean shirt, pressed jacket, polished shoes. When he walked downstairs, his daughter was at the kitchen table drawing on a piece of paper with her crayons. She lifted the paper proudly. "Look, Daddy, I drew our house." Daniel smiled, kneeling to look at it closely. The drawing was simple, but sweet, a little square house with a slanted roof, stick figures in front of it. "It's perfect," he said, kissing the top of her head. His wife placed a cup of coffee on the counter. "You're quiet this morning," she said softly. Daniel took a sip, trying to sound casual. "Just work," he said. "Something feels off lately." She gave him a concerned look but didn't press for details. She trusted him to handle things, and for years he always had. As he walked out the door to leave for work, he glanced at the house once more. It looked peaceful in the morning sun. He had no idea that by nightfall this same place would be filled with flashing lights and raised voices. The day at the office dragged by slowly. No one said anything directly to him, but the distance between him and everyone else was still there. Invisible, but heavy. He tried to focus on his reports, on the familiar rhythm of his job, but he couldn't ignore the undercurrent in the air. When the clock hit 5, Daniel decided to go home early. He told himself some rest would help clear his head. He drove, down the same street as always, past the grocery store and the park, unaware of the quiet storm building just beyond his sight. The sun was setting when he pulled into the driveway. The soft orange light touched the trees and the air carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. He stepped out of the car, stretched his shoulders, and walked toward the front door. Just as he reached for the handle, he heard it. The sharp sound of car doors closing behind him. Not one, but several. Daniel turned. 3 black SUVs had pulled up near the curb. Before he could process it, men and women in uniform stepped out. Their movements were firm, practiced. They were police officers. Daniel froze for a second, unsure what to say or do. He wasn't used to being on this side of things. He was the one who usually showed up at people's doors, not the one standing in front of them. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm but serious face, approached him. "Daniel Reed?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes. What's going on?" The officer reached into a folder and pulled out a piece of paper. "We have a warrant to search your home." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He blinked as if maybe he had heard wrong. "A warrant? To search my house?" Behind the officer, others were already stepping toward the door. Daniel raised his hands slightly, not in fear but in confusion. "Wait, there has to be a mistake. I work for the Bureau. You know who I am. The officer's tone stayed polite but firm. "Sir, please step aside. We need to execute the search." Daniel could feel his mouth go dry. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Just then the front door opened. His wife stood there holding their daughter in her arms. Her eyes widened when she saw the line of officers and their serious expressions. "Daniel, what is this?" He wanted to give her an answer, to make it all make sense, but he didn't have one. "I don't know," he whispered back. The officers entered the house with quiet precision. Some went upstairs. Others moved toward the office space near the living room. Daniel stood near the door, feeling both rooted to the ground and completely helpless. His little girl clung to her mother, asking in a small voice, "Why are there so many people here?" The officers opened drawers, checked cabinets, carefully searched through boxes. Their radios clicked softly as they communicated. One of them carried a laptop out of the office room and placed it on the dining table. Another started bagging files and external drives. Daniel's wife whispered, "They think you did something." Her voice trembled, but she didn't shout. She just looked at him like she was trying to understand something impossible. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I didn't do anything," he said. His voice was calm, but inside a storm was rising. Neighbors began to gather outside. Some peeked through curtains, others stood openly on the sidewalk. A few even held up their phones, recording the scene. The man they had always seen mowing his lawn, waving kindly, was now surrounded by police. The lead officer walked back toward Daniel. "We received information connecting this address to the transfer of classified data. We're here to collect potential evidence." Daniel stared at him. For a moment, it felt like the world had tilted sideways. "That's insane," he said. "I would never. This is my home. My family lives here." The officer didn't respond to that. He just nodded at his team to continue. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a call from one of his co-workers, but he didn't answer. He could imagine the whispers already spreading through the office. His name would travel fast. Inside the house, the sound of drawers opening and footsteps moving grew louder. Every small noise felt like a hammer striking against the walls of the life he had built. One of the officers walked out of the study holding a printed folder. "Found something," she said quietly. Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew what was in that folder. Regular case notes, nothing secret. But the way they said it made it sound like they had uncovered a buried truth. The tall officer flipped through the pages, then handed it to another member of the team. Daniel wanted to snatch it back, to explain everything line by line. But he wasn't the one in control anymore. His wife sat on the couch holding their daughter close. She didn't cry. She just stared ahead like someone watching a life she knew slowly unravel in front of her. After nearly an hour, the officers began sealing the evidence bags. They had collected laptops, external drives, documents, and even Daniel's personal phone. "Sir," the officer said, "we need you to come with us for questioning." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a choice. He looked at his wife. Her lips trembled, but she managed to whisper, "Tell me this isn't true." Daniel stepped closer to her, his voice soft but steady. "I swear I didn't do anything. I'll fix this, I promise." He bent down and gently touched his daughter's hair. She looked up at him with confused eyes, too young to understand why so many strangers were taking things from their home. As Daniel stepped outside with the officers, the flashing lights from the vehicles made everything feel surreal. The neighbors watched silently. The same people who had smiled at him every morning now stared at him like he was a headline. Inside his chest, a quiet panic pressed harder. He wanted to shout that this was a mistake, that he had spent years serving his country with honesty. But no one would have listened in that moment. The officer guided him toward one of the SUVs. Daniel didn't resist. He wasn't handcuffed, but the weight of being surrounded was enough to make the walk feel endless. When he turned his head, he saw his wife standing at the door with their daughter in her arms. Their porch light was on, but everything around it felt dark. As the vehicle door closed, Daniel stared at his house through the window. For the first time in years, it didn't look like home. It looked like the place where his world had begun to fall apart. The drive to the station was quiet. Daniel sat with his hands folded, feeling the rhythm of the road beneath the tires. He had been in this position hundreds of times before, sitting next to someone accused of something serious. But he had never imagined being the one under suspicion. When they arrived at the station, he stepped out calmly. He kept telling himself to breathe. He had nothing to hide. The truth would come out. It had to. But as he was led down the hall and the door of the interview room closed behind him, a new fear settled in. The truth doesn't always speak louder than suspicion. Somewhere out there, someone had said his name. Someone had tied him to something he didn't do. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't going to be fixed overnight. Outside, the night grew darker. Inside that small room, Daniel sat at the table, staring at the blank wall, trying to piece together how everything had changed in just a few hours. What he didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. Daniel sat alone in the cold interview room. The walls were plain gray and the overhead light hummed softly. The metal chair beneath him was uncomfortable, but that was the last thing on his mind. Hours had passed since the search at his house. He had answered question after question, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The people across the table didn't look at him the way colleagues once had. Their eyes held suspicion, not trust. For years he had sat on the other side of that same table, asking questions, reading body language, trying to figure out who was telling the truth. Now he was the one being studied, the one whose every movement was being quietly judged. A man and a woman, both dressed in dark suits, sat down in front of him. They placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were printed pages, photographs, and a stack of documents. Daniel watched them carefully. The woman leaned forward. "Daniel Reed," she began in a calm, steady voice. "We've gone through your devices and your work records. There are serious concerns we need to discuss." Daniel folded his hands tightly. "I've already told you I don't know anything about whatever you're looking for. This is a mistake." The man slid a photo across the table. "This image was captured from your bureau laptop. These are classified documents. They were sent out through your account late at night." Daniel stared at the photo, feeling his heartbeat in his ears. He recognized the documents. They belonged to a case from 2 months ago. He had worked on it, but he had never sent anything out. "I didn't send that," he said slowly. "Someone must have used my account. I wasn't even at home at that time." "Check my badge logs." The woman exchanged a quick look with her partner. "We've checked your badge activity. You were at an off-site meeting that day," she said carefully. "But the transfer happened through your system using your credentials." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being cornered by evidence that didn't belong to him but had his name all over it. He tried to steady his breathing. "Then someone hacked me. Or they cloned my access somehow. I would never leak information. You both know my record." The man flipped a page. "We also found unusual money transfers connected to an account opened under your name. A foreign account. Large sums of money." Daniel blinked, stunned. "A foreign account?" I don't even have one. I've never sent $1 overseas. Someone's setting me up. The woman spoke again, more softly this time. You have to understand how this looks, Daniel. From the outside, everything points to you. Her words hit him hard. For years, he had believed that truth always rose to the surface, that evidence would clear the innocent. But now, looking at the papers on the table, he saw what the world saw. A name, a timestamp, a transfer. To them, it looked like betrayal. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running his hand across his face. Please, he said quietly. I've served this country my whole life. I've given everything to this job. I would never do what you're accusing me of. They didn't answer right away. They just watched him. Then the man stood up, gathered the folder, and said, We'll continue tomorrow. The door closed behind them, leaving Daniel alone in the room again. For the first time in years, the silence felt unbearable. He wasn't just fighting for his job now. He was fighting for his name, his family, and the life he had built from the ground up. When they finally let him leave late that night, he walked out of the station feeling like a stranger in his own skin. The air was cold and sharp. His car was parked a few blocks away. He walked slowly, as if every step weighed a little more than the last. When he reached home, the house was quiet. The lights in the living room were dim. His wife sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red from crying. She didn't rush to him like she used to. She just stared at him, waiting for answers. They think I leaked classified files, Daniel said softly. His voice cracked on the last word. They think I took money. But it's not true. She didn't say anything for a long time. The silence between them was heavier than any question. Then, in a small, tired voice, she asked, Can they prove it's not you? Daniel didn't have an answer. And that silence told her everything she needed to know about how serious it was. Their daughter was asleep upstairs. Daniel looked toward her room and felt a sting in his chest. He had always promised to keep their home safe. But how could he protect them when the danger was a lie wrapped around his own name? The next few days turned into a blur of interviews, legal meetings, and endless paperwork. Daniel was officially placed on suspension. His badge and firearm were taken from him. Colleagues who once greeted him with easy smiles now lowered their eyes or avoided him altogether. He walked into the bureau one last time to clean out his desk. The hallway that had once felt familiar now felt cold. Some people whispered as he passed. Others pretended not to see him. The worst part was knowing that he couldn't blame them. The evidence against him was convincing. As he packed his things, an old friend from the cyber division quietly walked up to him. His voice was low. I don't believe you did this, he whispered. But whatever this is, it's deep. Be careful. Those were the only words anyone from the office had said to him in days that didn't feel like judgment. Back home, the weight of everything grew heavier. Lawyers called. Investigators showed up again. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Even simple errands felt different. People looked at him like he was already guilty. One afternoon, as Daniel sat on the back porch staring at the fading light, his wife joined him. They're saying things online, she said quietly. Your name's all over the news sites. They're calling you the mole. Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't even know how the story had leaked, but it had spread like fire. Once the world picks a side, it rarely listens to explanations. I didn't do this, he said again. I swear to you I didn't. She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. I believe you, she whispered. But even in her voice he could hear the fear. She believed him. But she also knew how these things worked. Meanwhile, a small group of people inside the bureau had started to quietly look at the case on their own. Daniel didn't know it yet, but someone had noticed something odd. His digital activity logs didn't match his location records. On the night the documents were sent, he had been across town at a briefing. But none of that had made it into the official reports yet. To the public and to the higher-ups, Daniel was still the man under suspicion. Every night he sat at the dining table, staring at the folders the lawyers gave him. He tried to piece everything together. Who could have done this? Who had access to his systems? His mind went through every case, every name, every access point. But the harder he thought, the more tangled everything became. Whoever had set him up knew exactly what they were doing. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in the living room with his old badge in his hand. It had always been a symbol of everything he stood for: honesty, loyalty, justice. Now it just felt like a reminder of everything he was losing. He whispered to himself, I'm not going down for something I didn't do. The fight wasn't over, but it was clear now this wasn't going to be simple. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame him. They hadn't just taken his job. They had taken his name, his trust, and the quiet life he had built. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened. More evidence appeared, almost too conveniently. More rumors spread. But in the quiet corners of the bureau, someone had begun to question whether it was all too perfect. Daniel didn't know it yet, but help was slowly forming in the shadows. Someone was watching the same evidence, yet and seeing the cracks in the story. But for now, Daniel stood alone in the storm. His life had changed overnight, and there was no going back. He wasn't just trying to clear his name anymore. He was fighting for the truth itself. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. A strange heaviness hung in the air. He sat at the edge of the couch, hands loosely locked together, staring at the window even though nothing was outside except the dark. He had spent years walking into crime scenes without hesitation, speaking with authority, guiding others through chaos. Now he couldn't even find the right words to explain what was happening to him. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was his life on the line. And worse, no one seemed to believe him completely. He kept replaying the search in his mind. The pounding on the door, the flash of lights, the look in the officers' eyes when they realized who he was. That shock on their faces had given him a small sense of relief, but it didn't wash away the feeling of being treated like a suspect. He hadn't slept much since that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sound of the door breaking open, boots on the floor, and his name being shouted like he was a criminal. His badge, and the same badge that once gave him respect, began now lay on the table, almost mocking him. His phone buzzed again. Another call he didn't want to take. Another reporter asking questions he couldn't answer. Another friend from work who didn't know how to talk to him anymore. It was strange how fast people's tone could change when doubt crept in. The worst part was the silence from some of the people he had trusted the most. No one openly accused him, but their silence was louder than any words. He could feel the distance, the way their messages became short and polite, as if they didn't want to get too close to a man whose name was now tied to an active investigation. A knock at the door made his stomach tighten. It wasn't loud, but after everything, even soft knocks felt like a threat. He walked slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. When he opened the door, he saw someone he didn't expect, one of his colleagues. She looked nervous, holding a folder close to her chest, glancing around as if she didn't want anyone to see her there. She didn't say much at first. She stepped inside, closed the door, and looked at him like she was carrying something heavy. "You need to know this," she finally said, lowering her voice. "Someone inside might have pushed your name into the system. It doesn't look clean." His heart thudded harder. That single sentence carried the weight of everything. If someone inside the agency had made it look like he was involved in something he wasn't, then this was bigger than a mistake. This was deliberate. He leaned forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "What do you mean it doesn't look clean?" he asked. She hesitated before explaining that some of the reports that triggered the search warrant had irregularities. Dates didn't match. Certain details didn't line up with official records. It looked like someone had wanted the search to happen, fast, without giving others time to review the files carefully. He felt both anger and fear rise together. He had trusted the system all his life. He had believed in procedure and honesty, in the idea that the truth always won if you did things right. But now it was clear that someone had played with the system and used it against him. She slid the folder across the table. Inside were copies of the reports, printed emails, and internal notes. "I shouldn't have brought this here," she said softly. "But if someone is trying to frame you, you need to know what's happening behind closed doors." For the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of something he had almost lost. Hope. It wasn't enough to clear his name yet, but it was a thread, something to pull, something to fight with, but hope also came with danger. If someone was willing to set him up, they wouldn't just stop because the truth was getting closer. Whoever did this had access, power, and the confidence to target a federal agent. That meant they were smart, careful, and dangerous. He spent the next few hours studying every piece of paper, every line, every date. He circled things, made notes, pieced together patterns that most people would have missed. Years of training weren't gone. They were just buried under fear. Now they began to surface again. He realized something small but important. A particular name appeared too many times in places it shouldn't have. A file was approved by the same person in multiple steps, something that wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't enough to prove guilt, but it was a crack in the wall. His colleague warned him to be careful. "If you make a wrong move," she whispered, "you could end up making things worse for yourself. They'll say you're interfering with the investigation." He knew she was right. Every step had to be calculated. Every word had to be chosen carefully. The next morning, he walked back into the agency building. He had avoided it for weeks, but now he couldn't stay away. As he stepped inside, heads turned. People tried not to stare, but they couldn't help it. It was the kind of quiet that said everything. Some nodded out of respect. Others looked away to avoid eye contact. He walked straight to a small office at the end of the hallway. It belonged to someone who still believed in him, a friend who had stood by his side during some of the toughest cases. He shared the folder quietly, letting the papers speak for themselves. His friend listened, frowned, and leaned closer to the desk. "This isn't just sloppy," he finally said. "This is planned." They both knew what that meant. Someone inside had used their position to twist the system, and if they didn't act carefully, it could all vanish. The proof, the paper trail, even their careers. Every hour felt heavier after that. He couldn't trust everyone, not even the people he had worked with for years. He spoke in whispers, avoided leaving a trace, and kept the most important pieces of evidence close. The walls that once felt like protection now felt like they were closing in. That night, as he walked to his car, a vehicle slowed down behind him. It wasn't unusual, but something about the way it lingered made him stop. The headlights washed over him, bright and silent. Then, just as suddenly, the car drove off. It didn't need to stay. The message was clear enough. Someone was watching. Back in his apartment, he stared at the folder again. This was no longer about clearing his name. It was about surviving something bigger than him. Someone powerful wanted him out of the way, and he was standing in the middle of their plan. But he wasn't the kind of man to give up. Fear was there, yes, but so was determination.
He had spent his life chasing the truth.
Now the truth was chasing him, and he was ready to fight back. As the night grew colder, he picked up the phone and made a call. Not to the agency, not to a friend, but to someone outside the system. Someone who didn't know anyone inside anything. If he was going to uncover this, he couldn't rely on the same people who might be involved in setting him up. The wheels were turning now, quietly, carefully. He didn't know exactly where it would lead. But one thing was clear, the story wasn't over. The person who had started this mess was still out there, confident and hidden. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated the man they tried to break. He closed the folder, looked out the window at the city lights, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long time, the fear didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a storm. And storms, no matter how strong, eventually passed.